We're going to talk about closing costs. And ultimately, when it comes to financing, again, sitting here with Nick Pakulla, my recommended lender, when it comes to negotiating with buyers, all of the buyers want the seller to pay my closing costs. And that is fine, and we can do that, and we can negotiate that. But there are often limits set by your loan or your lender as to how much you're allowed to negotiate. So you can't just throw a number out there and say, I want $15,000 if it doesn't fall within the requirements of your loan. So with Nick, what are the requirements based on FHA, conventional VA?
Yeah.
How much money can I actually ask for
Sure.
when I'm negotiating with a seller?
Yep. Conventional, we'll start with that one. It does depend on how much you're putting down. If you're putting down less than 10% with conventional, the max seller help is 3%. If you're putting down more than 10%, you can actually get a maximum of 6% closing help. Again, in our area, most of the time you're around 3.5% of the sales price for closing costs, so you wouldn't really be hitting the 6% maximum. For FHA, the maximum is 6% as well. Kind of same caveat. 3.5%. You don't always necessarily need to be asking for the full loan maximum allowable amount. VA, there's no technical limit for the closing help. However, you can't have more than 4% of things that are in excess of what VA defines as closing costs. So you have to check that one with your lender. But again, I would go back to, if your maximum closing costs are 3.5 in general, you're usually going to be covered in kind of all of these cases.
And here's the one thing to remember. There are more costs associated with buying the home than just what you have in closing. And what I mean by that is if you do a home inspection and the seller says, yeah, I agree, these things need to be fixed, but I'm out of town, or it's too much work, or I don't have enough time, let me give you a credit. If we've already maxed out how much we're allowed to get based on our loan, we cannot accept a credit. So you kind of have to understand what you're allowed to get from your lender, how much you've got already, can we ask for credits, can we get credits later on through the process. So just keeping in mind how much we're permitted to get in closing help will make the process a whole lot simpler as you not only go under contract with whatever you're agreeing to in a credit, but you've got a little bit that you can use later if you have to.
Right.
Anything else?
No, and I always say, you want to have a little bit of a cushion as well when you're going into this process. You don't want to necessarily say, I need exactly every penny. So when you're you're speaking with your lender about down payment and closing costs and getting seller credit, you want to come up with scenario A, B, and C for how, if the seller doesn't agree to give you all the amount, how are you still going to make this property work if it's the ideal property for you? And
the last thing on closing help, what you have to understand, and I've said this in another video as the buyer, what you have to understand, if you're buying a $100,000 home and the seller's willing to give you $5,000 in closing help, he is actually selling the home for $95,000, not $100,000. So if you want closing help, you're going to pay a little bit more than you actually could get that seller to come down to. Because realistically, we could get him to come down to 95, and we could pay our mortgage based on $95,000. But we're going to pay our mortgage based on $100,000, and he's going to give us $5,000 of that money back. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes that's a little bit confusing, but when you ask for closing help, you do pay a little bit more for the home. You get the closing help back. It really is all about the net number of the sale, not the actual sales price. It's the sales price minus whatever that closing help is.
And on that note, I would just add, keep in mind the bank is still going to order an appraisal on the home, so you can't just go in there if the value is not supported and just ask for a bunch of closing help. The value still has to be there. So in certain very competitive situations, you'll find listing agents actually looking more towards the no closing help offers because they know that the home doesn't have to appraise for as much if you're getting the closing help. So
Right. It's so freaking tricky. That's closing help. See ya.